I didn't go looking for this. I want to make that clear before anything else. I wasn't chasing conspiracies. I wasn't searching for hidden civilizations or forbidden history. I was doing something far more mundane, studying architectural patterns, doorways, staircases, the proportions of old government buildings, the kind of dry, academic research that puts most people to sleep. But something kept bothering me. The measurements didn't add up. Doorways in working corridors, not grand entrances, not ceremonial halls, but everyday functional passageways measuring 12, sometimes 15 feet high. Staircases with risers so tall that a normal adult has to consciously stretch their leg to climb them comfortably. Furniture in estate sales and museum storage rooms, chairs, desks, beds, all slightly too large, not throne room large, not intimidation large, just wrong, scaled for someone bigger than us. I filed it away as decorative excess, moved on. Then I found the photographs. Not paintings, not illustrations, not myths passed down through generations of embellishment and exaggeration. Photographs. Actual photographic evidence from the mid to late 1800s showing human beings of impossible scale standing next to regular-sized people. The size difference wasn't subtle. It wasn't the kind of thing you could explain away with camera angles or perspective tricks. These individuals stood 8, sometimes 9 feet tall, their proportions so dramatic they looked like composites, except they weren't composites. The grain matched, the lighting matched, the shadows fell correctly. And these images predated the technology needed to fake them convincingly. That's when I stopped filing things away. That's when I started asking questions. And that's when the official explanations, every single one of them, began to collapse. Once I started looking, I couldn't stop finding them. Cartes de visite from the 1860s, cabinet cards from the 1870s, tintype images from the 1880s and 1890s, photographs showing men and occasionally women standing 8, sometimes 10 feet tall, positioned next to individuals of completely normal height, not circus performers with advertised names and touring schedules, not documented showmen with verified histories and promotional materials, just people. Ordinary individuals photographed in formal settings, wearing period-appropriate clothing, sometimes surrounded by family members of completely normal stature. The British Museum archives contain several of these images. The Smithsonian references them in passing, then dismisses them as medical anomalies and moves on without further investigation. French collections catalogue similar photographs and file them away. Russian imperial records reference persons of unusual stature serving in ceremonial and administrative roles. Always the same pattern. Acknowledge, categorize, move on, never investigate, never ask why. But I kept asking why. Why were there so many? Why do these photographs cluster in specific decades, primarily between 1850 and 1900, and then suddenly, almost completely disappear? Why do contemporary accounts from that period describe these individuals not as freaks or medical curiosities, but as normal, functioning members of society, holding positions of authority, working as guards, serving as overseers and foremen on large construction projects? And here is the detail that changes everything. Many of these photographs show the giants standing in front of buildings, massive buildings, buildings with doorways that seem absurdly, almost comically oversized for normal human beings, but perfectly, logically proportioned for the individuals standing in front of them. Buildings we have been told were designed for grandeur, for intimidation, for the aesthetic ambitions of architects who simply thought bigger was better. But grandeur doesn't require 12-foot interior corridors. Intimidation doesn't require oversized risers in back stairwells where no visitor ever walks. Once you see it, you genuinely cannot unsee it, so I started measuring things systematically. Government buildings from the 1700s and 1800s, courthouses, administrative centers, the everyday working architecture of governance and oversight, and the numbers were consistent in a way that coincidence simply cannot explain. Interior doorways, not grand entrances, not public-facing facades, but working corridors and back hallways, measuring 12 to 15 feet high. Staircases with risers requiring an uncomfortable stretch for anyone under 6 feet tall. Desks, chairs and beds found in museum storage and estate sales, all running slightly large, all dismissed without investigation as decorative choices or custom commissions for tall individuals. But it isn't one building, it isn't one city, it isn't one country. It is thousands of structures across multiple continents, all built within the same historical window, all featuring the same proportional irregularities. In St. Petersburg, administrative buildings from the 1700s have 12-foot doors in back hallways that no public eye was ever meant to see. In Buenos Aires, municipal structures feature staircases requiring strides that would be uncomfortable for any average adult. In Delhi, colonial-era government buildings, supposedly constructed by and for British administrators of entirely normal height, contain furniture and fittings at scales that would make a 6-foot man feel like a child sitting in an adult's chair. These were not ceremonial spaces. These were offices, waiting rooms, working environments where comfort and usability would have been the primary design concern, not aesthetic ambition. There is no logical reason to build a functional workspace at twice the necessary scale unless the people using it were twice the necessary size. So who were they built for? That question led me somewhere I didn't expect to go. If you pull out a map from the 1700s, not a modern reproduction, an actual historical atlas from that period, you will find, printed with the same casual certainty as France or Spain or the Ottoman Empire, a territory called Tartaria, a vast region spanning northern Asia, appearing in encyclopedias, in geographical surveys, in diplomatic records, in the kind of authoritative reference material that serious scholars relied upon. It isn't a legend, it isn't a folk myth. It is labeled geography, treated as established fact, referenced without controversy. And then, sometime in the mid-1800s, it vanishes. Not through conquest with documented battles and treaties, not through gradual renaming with transitional records showing the shift. It simply disappears. The maps are redrawn. The encyclopedias are revised. The history books move forward as if the territory never existed, as if the word Tartaria was never written in authoritative ink on serious maps by serious cartographers. But the architecture remains. Massive stone structures across Central Asia, Russia, and Mongolia. Buildings of impossible scale and engineering precision. Doorways sized for individuals far larger than us. Halls that dwarf their modern occupants. Construction so precise and so enduring that we still cannot fully explain how it was achieved with the technology those regions supposedly possessed at the time. What if Tartaria wasn't just a geographical label? What if it represented something organized, something sophisticated, something that employed giants not as curiosities but as functional members of an administrative class? And what if the architecture we inherited, the buildings that still stand, the doorways that still tower over us, the staircases we still climb awkwardly, reflects the physical reality of the people who actually built and occupied them? It would explain the photographs. It would explain why they're always formal, always official, always showing these individuals in positions of authority rather than domestic settings. It would explain why they disappear after the 1890s, right when the last references to Tartaria are quietly removed from official cartographic record. It would explain why the buildings remain, but the occupants have been written out of history entirely. The photographic record is not the only evidence. Throughout the 1800s and into the early 1900s, mainstream newspapers across America published regular accounts of giant human skeletal remains being discovered. Not tabloid sensations, not fringe publications chasing readership with outrageous claims. The New York Times, the San Diego Union, the Middletown Signal, serious regional newspapers reporting what was, at the time, considered newsworthy but not particularly controversial. The accounts are remarkably consistent. Skeletons measuring 7 to 12 feet in length, found in organized burial sites rather than scattered or isolated locations, frequently accompanied by artifacts suggesting advanced metallurgy and sophisticated construction knowledge, sometimes arranged in patterns suggesting ritual or hierarchy. Discovered during the kind of large-scale excavation that came with railroad construction, canal digging, and urban expansion, the infrastructure projects that were tearing open the American earth throughout the second half of the 19th century. The New York Times, 1885, a 7-foot skeleton discovered in a Michigan mound. The San Diego Union, 1895, bones of extraordinary size uncovered during railroad excavation. The Middletown Signal, 1899, giant human remains found in Ohio. Then something changes. Around 1920, these reports stop, not gradually, not as discovery rates naturally decline. Abruptly, discoveries that were once front-page news simply cease to appear in print. The skeletons already recovered, many of them shipped to the Smithsonian Institution for further study, are no longer discussed. No published analyses, no follow-up investigations, no formal conclusions. The Smithsonian, when asked today, states that no such skeletons exist in their collections. Lost, misplaced during routine transfers, missing without documentation. Hundreds of specimens, all gone, all without a single paper trail explaining where they went or what happened to them. The pattern is too consistent, too precise, too perfectly timed to be explained by institutional carelessness. Discoveries peak in the late 1800s. The giant photographs cluster in the same decades. Tartaria disappears from maps in the same period. And then, around the turn of the century, everything stops at once. The photographs stop. The newspaper reports stop. The maps are redrawn. The encyclopedias are revised. As if someone somewhere decided that certain questions were no longer acceptable to ask. Here is what I want you to consider. Not as wild speculation, not as fantasy, as a hypothesis that fits the evidence more cleanly than anything the official narrative currently offers. What if the giants weren't rulers? What if they weren't kings or gods or mythological figures elevated by superstitious populations who didn't understand what they were seeing? What if they were something far more practical, a specialized class? Guardians, overseers, administrators of infrastructure and large-scale construction. Individuals whose physical size wasn't ceremonial but functional, selected or employed specifically because their scale made them effective at tasks that normal humans could not perform as efficiently. Think about what that would explain. It would explain why government buildings, courthouses, and administrative centers feature oversized proportions while residential neighborhoods remain entirely human-scaled. The working environments of the overseer class were built to their specifications. The homes of the general population were not. It would explain the construction mystery that historians continue to quietly sidestep. How massive stone structures built with such precision across Eurasia, the Americas, and beyond, using technology we still cannot fully account for. Perhaps they weren't built by the civilizations we credit them to. Perhaps they were built for those civilizations by a society that employed individuals physically capable of moving stones, operating tools, and overseeing construction at scales we currently consider impossible. It would explain why the photographs always show these individuals in formal, official contexts, not at markets, not at festivals, not in domestic settings, in administrative buildings, in official portraits, in the working spaces of governance and oversight. And most critically, it would explain the systematic erasure. If you inherit structures you didn't build, if you move into an architectural system designed for a different kind of human being and claim it as your own civilization's achievement, what do you do with the evidence that contradicts that claim? You adapt the narrative. You revise the construction dates. You remove the individuals whose existence proves someone else was here first. The evidence doesn't stop at buildings and photographs. I started finding other things, physical objects, tangible artifacts that had been quietly catalogued, mislabeled, and moved to the back corners of institutional storage where no one was likely to ask inconvenient questions about them. Chairs, not thrones, not ceremonial display pieces commissioned to impress visiting dignitaries. Ordinary functional chairs, dining chairs, desk chairs, sitting chairs, designed for daily use by whoever needed to sit in them. except their proportions make no anatomical sense for a normal human being. Seat heights measuring 30 to 36 inches from the floor, nearly double the standard 18-inch height that accommodates average human leg length. Backrests rising 7, sometimes 8 feet high. Armrests positioned so far above standard height that a person of normal stature would sit with their arms dangling uselessly at their sides. Auction catalogs list them as decorative furniture, display pieces. As if people in the Victorian era routinely commissioned chairs they couldn't physically use for purely aesthetic reasons. Museum curators label them oversized Victorian design without explaining why such designs appear not in ballrooms or reception halls, but in government offices, courthouse waiting rooms, and administrative centers, functional spaces where usability would presumably matter more than aesthetics. And then there are the tools. Massive wrenches recovered from demolition sites across Europe and North America. Tools measuring 4, 5, sometimes 6 feet in length. Not decorative, not ceremonial. Functional tools with real wear patterns, the kind of grip erosion that only comes from sustained, heavy use over extended periods of time. Tools designed for hands considerably larger than ours, requiring grip strength that no single normal human being could generate. Museums catalog them as industrial equipment without explaining what industrial process would require a wrench weighing 200 pounds, operated by someone with the combined grip strength of several normal men. Auction houses sell them as antique curiosities without asking why they were manufactured in sufficient quantities that they keep reappearing in estate sales, in barn cleanouts, in building demolitions more than a century after they were supposedly last used. These aren't isolated finds. They keep surfacing over and over again, in the same regions, from the same historical period, quietly absorbed into collections and storage rooms where the questions they raise are never formally addressed. What disturbs me most isn't the evidence itself. I've made peace with the evidence. Strange as it is, unexplained as it remains, the evidence at least exists in the world in a form I can examine. What disturbs me, what I genuinely cannot reconcile, is the coordinated silence surrounding it. Academic institutions don't debate the giant skeletons. They don't publish papers arguing against the interpretations. They don't engage with the photographs and explain systematically why they're misleading. They simply pretend the evidence never existed. They absorb it into archives marked miscellaneous or unverified and move on without discussion, without investigation, without so much as a formal dismissal. Museums don't display the photographs. They don't present them as curiosities alongside explanatory placards about medical conditions or camera techniques. They file them away. They label them incorrectly. They make them effectively inaccessible to anyone who isn't specifically looking for them and already knows they exist. Historical societies don't investigate the architectural proportions. They don't commission studies or publish findings. They repeat the phrase artistic choice and move on, as if the phrase itself constitutes a full and satisfying explanation. This pattern repeats across disciplines, across countries, across centuries of accumulated scholarship. And I want to be precise about something. This isn't what active suppression looks like. Active suppression leaves traces, records of decisions made, orders given, materials confiscated. What I'm describing is something subtler and in some ways more effective. Passive erasure, questions that simply aren't asked, evidence that isn't examined, connections that aren't drawn because drawing them leads somewhere the institutional framework isn't designed to accommodate. When you raise these questions in academic settings, the response is consistent and revealing, not refutation, not counter-evidence, not rigorous engagement with the specific claims, just a slight tightening around the eyes, a practiced dismissiveness, and two words that are somehow expected to close the conversation entirely. Interesting, but not significant. As if coincidence explains everything. As if pattern recognition is a form of irrationality rather than the foundational method of all historical inquiry. I keep coming back to the photographs. Not the buildings, not the newspapers, not the missing skeletons or the oversized tools or the maps that were quietly redrawn while no one was paying close enough attention: the photographs. Because the photographs show faces. These weren't monsters emerging from folklore. They weren't symbolic figures invented to explain what primitive people couldn't understand. They were people, individuals with expressions and clothing and family members standing beside them. People who sat for formal portraits the way anyone sat for formal portraits in the 1800s, with patience, with a certain self-consciousness, with the ordinary human desire to be seen and remembered. And we have made them impossible by refusing to remember them. We have taken documented, photographic reality and reclassified it as forbidden speculation. We have drawn a line somewhere in the historical record and decided, apparently collectively and without much public discussion, that certain kinds of evidence don't qualify as evidence, that certain questions don't qualify as questions worth asking. But the buildings remain. The massive doorways still stand open. The oversized staircases still rise to their uncomfortable heights. The architecture that makes no functional sense for human proportions continues to serve modern purposes, its original logic obscured by centuries of adaptive reuse and confident mislabeling. We walk through these spaces every day. We accept the explanations offered without examining whether those explanations actually explain anything. Because truly examining them requires accepting something uncomfortable. It requires accepting that history isn't a clean, unbroken line of progress moving steadily from primitive to sophisticated, from simple to complex, from ignorance to understanding. It requires accepting the possibility that we are living in the remnants of something we didn't build, something more sophisticated than we've been taught, something designed for a different kind of human being, inherited without full comprehension, claimed without complete understanding. The giants in the photographs weren't aberrations. They were evidence of a different arrangement, a different society, a different world that existed within living photographic memory and was quietly, systematically, almost entirely removed from the story we tell ourselves about who we are and where we came from. The buildings remember even when we don't. The photographs preserve what the encyclopedias erased. The evidence persists, patient, quiet, waiting for someone willing to ask the questions that everyone else has agreed, without ever quite saying so out loud, not to ask. Who were the giants? Why did they disappear? And what else vanished with them, that we are still pretending was never here at all?